Hello, my name is Clive Billenness and I'm a lay member of the General Synod of the Church of England. I'm a certified auditor with almost 40 years professional experience of auditing, and I'm also a qualified project and risk manager. I'm also a member of the Archbishops Council Audit Committee, who are supposed to have oversight of the work of the Archbishops Council to ensure proper financial governance and risk management. Professor Alexis Jay's report recommending that the Church of England pass responsibility for the operation and oversight of safeguarding to two independent charities has not been immediately accepted by the Church. When I proposed at the meeting of the General Synod of the Church of England in February that we immediately began acting to implement Professor Jay's recommendations, it was opposed by no fewer than 27 Church of England bishops. One of the major sticking points has appeared to be what is meant by independence in the context of safeguarding, and whether it's possible to achieve this. From columnists in the Church Times to individual safeguarding officers, I'm seeing the same argument being rolled out to argue against Professor Jay's recommendations, that the Church of England is special and independence will be too difficult to implement. In episode 1 of the J-Files, we also quoted ISB member Steve Reeves, who complained that when the Church said independent, they really meant semi-detached, which is why we've entitled this episode Detached or Semi-Detached, as we share some research on what totally detached could look like. So let's take a look at the term independent. What would it really mean in the context of safeguarding within the Church? At present, safeguarding officers are employed by the diocese in which they serve. Their pay, their jobs, their overall supervision and management is all ultimately driven from the diocese, where they must investigate safeguarding cases. If a safeguarding officer to upset their diocesan colleagues or rock the boat, they could find their budgets cut, their resources squeezed, or even staff removed in the name of budget reductions, with the argument that this is to help fund frontline clergy posts. This inevitably calls into question whether in undertaking their work they can be relied upon to act objectively and impartially when potentially investigating senior and influential members of the diocese. And the issue is one of doubt and perception, not necessarily one of actual misconduct. In her book, Sex, Power and Control, former diocesan safeguarding advisor Fiona Gardner speaks of powerful networks, formal and informal, within the Church, which affect how safeguarding cases are pursued. She also warns that alongside access to power and control, there is the existential fear of power being taken away or control overrun. The means of addressing this is by the creation of independent bodies which are protected from becoming enmeshed and in thrall to these networks. And the J approach would not only serve to eliminate such a risk, but would also provide an assurance to congregations, and more importantly to victims of abuse, that they would be protected by an entirely safe and objective organisation. So, what would true independence actually look like? Well, perhaps a good place to start will be with guidance from the European Court of Human Rights. Article 6 of the European Convention on Human Rights grants the right to a fair trial by an independent and impartial court or tribunal. For the court, the concept of independence and impartiality within any judicial system are closely linked. And the first consideration is how members of the court are selected, whether they're able to operate free of influence by the executive, those who run the whole system, and who cannot be allowed to overrule the decisions of the independent court. And in dealing with a case referred from the UK, Findlay versus the United Kingdom 22-107-93, the court held that a court-martial failed the test of independence and impartiality owing to the manner in which court members were appointed by their superior officer and who were directly or ultimately under his command. Now this measure mirrors very closely the situation in which diocesan safeguarding advisors find themselves at present. The Scottish High Court subsequently cited this case in the case of Stars versus Ruxton in 1999, stating that the test of whether a tribunal is independent and impartial embraces the question as to whether it presents the appearance of independence from an objective standpoint. And that objective standpoint cannot be established by reference to how a court might have acted in one particular case. The key is to have essential objective conditions or guarantees of independence, and not a perception of how it will act or has acted in the past, since past performance cannot be taken as an indicator of the future. Individuals might change, relationships might become soured, so independence must be assured whatever occurs. And in this particular case, the ability to influence the period of employment of a Scottish sheriff or judge was seen as detracting from independence, and overall the High Court dismissed the case for lack of independence. So English, Scottish and European courts have all held that the process of appointment of someone required to act independently, how their salaries are determined and how they can be removed from post or their career progression influenced, are all harmful to actual independence and also to perceptions of independence. But of course, courts are not the only place where independence and impartiality matter. I'm an auditor, and in order to maintain the confidence of shareholders of private companies or public donors to charities or even congregations of churches, it's essential that my complete independence from the body which I'm auditing is clear and beyond question. And in 2021, the Professional Ethics Division of the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants published a book, The Plain English Guide to Independence, which over 55 pages considers what barriers might exist to being considered independent based on working relationships past or present, the impact of family relationships with a client body, and even the receiving of gifts. And the entire book, starts with a very clear definition of independence, that it's independence of mind is the state of mind that permits a member to perform a service without being affected by influences that compromise professional judgment, thereby allowing an individual to act with integrity and exercise objectivity and professional sarcasm. Independence in appearance is the avoidance of circumstances that will cause a reasonable and informed third party who has knowledge of all relevant information, including safeguards applied, to reasonably conclude that the integrity, objectivity, or professional scepticism of an individual is compromised. And in 2022, two Ukrainian economists published a paper setting out the principles of independence of internal auditors, and they emphasise that a conflict of interest which compromises independence exists if the person has a competing personal or professional interest, and continues to exist even if no unethical or improper act occurs, simply because it creates an appearance of impropriety. Threats, intimidation, or pressure from within the organisation are seen as fatal to proper independence. So, against this background, can safeguarding officers who are in the direct employment and supervision of the organisation, the diocese, where they are supposed to be investigating incidents, really be considered to be independent?
And would the same problems not arise with the National Safeguarding Team running out of Church House, where the various members report to the Central Secretariat and Secretary-General, whose overall task is to look after the interests of the institution? This is serious structural objection. Can this be regarded as truly independent? I think it's pretty self-evidently the answer is no.
Most, if not all, of the tests of independence defined by courts of law and international professional accounting bodies which I have set out are failed where safeguarding staff are in any way employed by or somehow dependent on the diocese where they're operating. As a principle, this potentially expands all the way down to anyone who is reliant on a bishop for any form of preference, be it a permission to officiate as a lay or ordained person, salaried employment, or a position of authority, as well as any close relation of theirs. And the issue of independence in safeguarding was raised in a survey conducted by Professor Jay and her colleagues during their work. Of the 1,000+ people who responded, in every category, the vast majority considered that it was important or very important for the safeguarding function to have its own leadership team and not be accountable to the Church of England. More than 2/3 of victims and survivors felt that it was important or very important that there should be no involvement whatsoever of individuals employed by the Church of England in safeguarding. And it seems therefore that complete independence of safeguarding is an essential quality of whatever emerges as the Church of England's response to the Jay report.
Thank you, Clive. Now, I want to address the issue of conflicts of interests, which have figured prominently in the evidence Professor Jay received from complainants and respondents alike. They are also fatal to the perception of independence. The Church of England is shot through with such conflicts, which we may illustrate in video 3, but let me follow your example and go back to basics. I want to start the discussion of conflicts of interest with a couple of legal references which illustrate how the secular world approaches what is and what is not a conflict of interest. There are plenty of examples of how various professions handled these matters in the law, banking, auditing, and even the conduct of members of Parliament. This is not a new problem, and the very basic rule is very simple. If you think you have, or that you might reasonably be perceived to have a conflict of interest, then you have a conflict of interest and should step back from your role and bring somebody else in to do it, someone who is unquestionably independent. The Jay proposals eliminate these problems. The Church is very bad at this, and this is why Professor Jay has recommended that there be complete separation of safeguarding. You will not have heard all the horror stories, but she and John O'Brien have. A major problem and point of principle arises from the role of the bishop. But before we go there, let me talk about the most ancient of offices of state within the British Constitution, that of the Lord Chancellor. For centuries, he was the most powerful person in the kingdom. He was the right-hand man of the king. The Lord Chancellor had precedence over all others in a procession behind the king, and that's why the Justice Secretary, Penny Mordaunt, was carrying the sword at the coronation. The original office had 3 parts to it. As the Chief Minister of the King, the Lord Chancellor was part of the government executive. But he sat in the House of Lords as Speaker, so he was part of the legislature. He was also the leading judge, and as such was part of the judiciary. The important doctrine of the separation of powers was breached in the very person of this one official alone. He was obviously conflicted, and so when the Human Rights Act was passed, the office had to come to an end, its various roles separated out to prevent such fundamental conflicts of interest. Now consider the role of a bishop in the Church of England. He or she sits in the House of Bishops within Synod as a legislator. They rule over their diocese, much like one of the old prince bishops did, with so much autonomy. And incidentally, that is part of why Professor Jay found safeguarding qualities so variable in quality and resource. And when ecclesiastical law matters come out, they have to be making decisions about the cases. Importantly, the bishop's role is under scrutiny, but if anyone calls for a vote of all the houses, the House of Bishops can effectively wield a veto on any fundamental reform, and as such, they will be acting as judges in their own cause. Additionally, he or she is the shepherd of the flock, supposedly looking after both sides of a dispute pastorally, whether individuals or congregations, and he also has to try and maintain the reputation of the church. When the Human Rights Act was passed, all that changed for the Lord Chancellor. The formal separation of powers had to be reasserted, and the old compromised office had to be reformulated, and so it was. So if the country's most respected of judges cannot be trusted to juggle these various functions, why should the average bishop be regarded as better qualified to do so, given the additional dimensions of their pastoral responsibilities? We need to step away from feudal models and into the 21st century in safeguarding, which is a fundamentally secular activity. Let's remind ourselves that in recent years, no diocesan bishop has been found who wants to be the role of lead bishop for safeguarding. It's both a burden and a poisoned chalice. The Jay reforms allow them to get rid of this work and the responsibility, which they do not do very satisfactorily, and it allows them to concentrate on other things, leaving dedicated experts to get on with this difficult and sensitive work. nobody believes that the bishops do it very well. And so the Jay Review is offering everyone a clean, fresh start.
Now, we do understand that initially this seems very unsettling to the Church and some of its employees. There are seriously vested interests in play here. But we can look at those in the next video when we'll be exploring the objections which have begun to emerge. There are legitimate concerns, but we hope to be able to show that with goodwill we can address those based on what Professor Jay is actually proposing and not on fear or rumour. Professor Jay and her legal advisers are advancing new structures that will eliminate the poor and confused conceptualisations of the past. Provided no one starts tinkering with the fundamentals of the Jay proposals, we will have clarity, consistency, independence, freedom from conflicts of interest, and fairness to everyone. And that's the object of the exercise, isn't it?
Of course it is. And this, of course, is the beauty and simplicity of the Jay legal architecture. All these structural problems and injustices, all the tensions disappear. There are clear lines of responsibility and everyone can get on with their jobs free from the conceptual confusions that cause decades of woolly thinking. And also, let's not forget, it caused the ISB to crash because we didn't get it clear from the outset.
So, having set out what the structures look like and why conceptual clarity is vital, we next have to look at how the Jay proposals could impact life on the diocesan safeguarding front line, as well as the potential opportunities they offer. And that we should look at next time. So see you then for part 3 of the Jay Files.